Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this ACTE Spotlight webinar. My name is Ashley Campo and I am the Customer Care Coordinator here at ACTE. I'm going to be facilitating today's webinar where we will be discussing the need for CTE teachers and the support and resources that are available to help them be successful. This is the first in a series that we will be presenting throughout the 2018-19 school year that's going to be focused on CTE teacher resources. So keep an eye out for the upcoming pieces of this webinar. I'd like to introduce our presenters for this session, Dr. John Foster, the President and CEO of ACTE, and Dr. Linda Jackson, the former Director of the Southern Regional Educational Board Tech Centers That Work. We do have a fair number of participants this afternoon, so I will be muting everyone in order to reduce background noise, but please feel free to send questions through the chat box and we'll try to respond throughout the presentation. Otherwise, we do have time for a short question and answer period at the end of the presentation so that we will be able to answer questions then as well. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Everyone, please welcome John and Linda.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Linda Jackson, and I was the Director of Technology Centers That Work for the Southern Regional Education Board. Prior to that, I'm a retired school superintendent and educator, and in my 36 years. And this year, I'm doing something very fun. I'm back into a career tech center working with new teachers. So one of the things that we know is that CTE is growing. However, we know there's a shortage. And in 1975, 22% of the students that were attending our four-year universities were majoring in education. And in 2015, it went down to around 10%. So people ask me all the time, why is there a teacher shortage? And my simple response to them is, teaching is hard. Somebody standing on the outside looking in sees that teachers go from 8 to 3, have their summers off, but we know, those of us in the trenches, that that's not what's really happening. We spend our evenings planning, grading papers, supporting social, emotional, and intellectual needs of students. And teacher turnover is great, and we know that. And we've got to think about ways that we can support teachers and administrators so that we do not have this attrition rate. Did you know that 77% of new teachers stay in the profession for the duration of the first 3 years? This is costing school districts and the economy billions of dollars, and it contributes to low teacher morale and disrupts student learning.
Yeah, that's great information, Linda. And you know, I'd just like to chime in and talk a little bit about the characteristics of most of the new career and technical education teachers, especially the ones that enter without a background or pedagogy in teaching in the classroom. I'm talking mostly about folks who come in directly from industry, but there are others who do come in with advanced degrees but have never spent much time in a classroom environment. So let me just talk about a couple of things that are typical about these new CTE teachers. As you can see on the screen there, they typically start their teaching career in an older age, and the reason for this is because most of them, at least the majority of the ones that we've run across, have had a number of years of experience in their particular industry sector, whether that be health or manufacturing or construction or whatever it is. They are different than your typical secondary or middle school or even elementary teacher in that they don't really come from a traditional college preparatory background. You know, a typical college student, you know, may come in at the age of 22, 23, whereas a teacher in CTE typically, from our experience anyway, starts maybe in their middle 30s and beyond. So they're a little bit older and have some more years experience behind them. And like it says on the slide, they typically have had a lot of years actually performing their content experience before they enter teaching. They often, make a big career change. Many people who make career changes willingly don't have the kind of hurdles that a CTE teacher, a new CTE teacher would have. I mean, in addition to jumping from, one industry, whatever it happens to be, into the industry, if you will, of education, and in addition to taking the what's typically a salary reduction to do that kind of thing, and typically for an altruistic kind of motivation, they change their whole culture and relationships. At one point in their careers, in their previous employment, they were able to talk to their peers, one-to-one about what was going on and things like that. In this new environment, they're dealing with students who are younger than them and, don't have the same kind of background or experiences. And lastly, I'd just like to mention that, these individuals who make the decision to move into career and technical education from the outside world, so to speak, do have to make a long-term commitment to catch up with other educational requirements. Most states have a licensing procedure that requires, certain minimal requirements that are typically met through a bachelor's degree route. And folks coming in from some other degree route don't necessarily have these educational requirements. So they spend their time in provisional licenses and emergency licensures, catching up with those educational requirements that the state requires of their teachers.
So Educational Leadership recently wrote an article that really resonated with me, and it talked about the 3 areas in which new CTE teachers commonly struggle. And I wholeheartedly, in my 36 years in education, believe all 3 of these are the top 3, and the number 1 being classroom management. And there's a slide that talks about the continuum of what happens during the first year of teaching. And the first phase in the continuum is anticipation. You come in August and you're ready to work, and you're excited, and you have this real fantasy about what's going to happen in your classroom. But by September and October, you get into that survival phase where classroom management has become a problem. Some teachers believe that they don't need classroom rules and procedures. They thought that they would just charm the students into behaving. So now they're trying to backpedal and work on some of those issues that have gotten out of control. Planning is not going well. They're spending multiple hours in the evenings trying to work on effective lesson plans. Then they get into the disillusionment phase, and this usually happens around the last of October and usually happens through Christmas. And this is that phase where you have low teacher morale, you don't know if you're going to last, and your classroom management escalates. But then what happens is you go into January in this rejuvenation phase. You've had a Christmas break, time with your family and friends, and you start thinking about things that you can do differently. And after the rejuvenation, things get better throughout the spring. And in May, you start that reflection. So if you are a first-year teacher, just remember that this happens to most first-year teachers. When we talk about curriculum freedom, what we know is that veteran teachers predominantly want to be able, they don't need the guidance. But what we're finding with new CTE teachers is there is a lack of guidance and resources available for many CTE teachers. And they find that they're really floundering, and they're often spending 10 to 12 hours a day juggling lesson plans, grading, demands of paperwork, CTSOs. They've also found that they feel like that a majority of your new CTE teachers feel like they're in an unsupportive environment. They feel like they report difficulty interacting with colleagues, from cooperation, from lack of cooperation to even some hostility. So those are the top three things, and throughout this book that John is going to talk about, we help you to deal with those as we move forward. So when we talk about the other article in educational leadership is when we talk about this idea of relationships with students, parents, and guardians, what we're trying to figure out, and new CTE teachers try to figure out, is how to navigate the political climate, how to deal with all of these different stakeholders that want to or need support, and you're trying to figure out how to help them. Also, you've got this workload, time management, and fatigue. It's a sink or swim. Many new teachers are working 10 to 12 hours a day. Knowledge of your subject and curriculum. CTE teachers really are great with their technical skills, but they don't know how, and they haven't been trained in how to embed the academic skills and how to use effective instructional strategies in a timely manner to support the curriculum. Then there's this idea of the evaluation and grading, what to grade, when to grade, and how to grade. And that can take a life of its own when teachers do not know how to effectively navigate that.
That's right, Linda. You know, and you mentioned it early on about teacher kind of burnout. You know, when teachers leave their altruistic kind of mindset, and they said this is just too much, and they go back to industry, or they go someplace else. I mean, we did some work in California with a program, and their research indicated that without a mentor or some help or some supportive environment, many new teachers, CTE teachers in particular, left within their first 3 to 4 years. So we had met, several years ago, I guess, with the folks at ACTE, and we thought, what can we do to change that dynamic a little bit? How can we help new CTE teachers? And so we came up with a thought of at least producing a book series that would be, relatively light, but would hit the topics that we've been talking about. So in collaboration with ACTE and their bookstore, we've come up with 3 books. The first book, the one that we're talking about today, is really a survival book. It's about the first 3 months that an individual coming in from an industry setting into an education setting would need to survive. It's about establishing relationships and bounds, and some of the things that Linda and I will be talking about in just a little bit. Book 2 is really about the teacher who's kind of made it through that survival part, and it's kind of things that you should know at the end of your first year, or things that you should have picked up. It's about the intricacies of lesson planning. It's about working with career and technical student organizations. It's about working with advisory committees and things like that. It's a little bit more than just the survival that the first book was about. And then in book 3, we're talking really about becoming a professional. We're talking about somebody who's probably somewhere in the vicinity of their 3rd year, maybe their 4th year. It's about, giving back to the community in which you live, about working with, community organizations, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, church groups, whatever it happens to be, to promote your particular, occupational or technical specialty. So that's the intent of the 3 books. And when we start to look at the actual chapter layout for each of those, they're all pretty much the same. We give folks some content, usually in the vicinity of 6-7 pages, somewhere in that range. And then we talk about something we call Tools for Your Toolbox. And this is about real teachers' contributions to the books. We try to put about 3 case studies in each one of those chapters. So that's about 30 case studies per book. So when you look at all 3 books, we have not only the 3 authors or 4 authors, but we also have roughly 90 contributions from all across the country. We also try to, kind of summarize each chapter and just put together for the reader a couple of key learnings, just maybe 6 or 8 or 10 things that they should have picked up out of those pieces of content. And then lastly, but yet very importantly, we also have additional resources supplied at the end of the book. Not only just the bibliography, but additional resources that teachers might find useful. So when you look at the first book that we're kind of talking about today, some of the chapter topics include those things that are listed on the slide. They're things like developing your support system, the culture in the classroom, the value of mentoring, how you can develop your own networking, the importance of safety. Linda talked about, evaluation of students. We talk a little bit about challenging students to be their best selves in book 1 and how we can help students do that. But those are the kinds of topics that we cover in the book. So Linda's going to talk about a couple of them, and I'll talk about one myself, and then we can take questions. So Linda, go ahead and take it away.
So Chapter 3 is all about support systems, and if you're in a state or a district that has a formal teacher mentoring program, then I applaud your state and your school or district, because I think it's one of the most crucial things we can do for new teachers. But if you aren't in a state or a school district that has a mentoring program, then you need to navigate the system to get a support system. And there's kind of 2 support systems that are outlined in Chapter 3. And one is that personal support system of your families and friends, but the other one is that professional support system. And the book focuses on 3 different areas and how that looks. When you go into a regular comprehensive high school, those teachers have had student teaching. They're also paired in an English department or a math department, and they have multiple colleagues that they can go to for support. In a career tech center, you might be the only culinary teacher or the only auto tech teacher, but there are people in that building that can support you. And the first support is your supervisory role, and that's usually the principal or some type of instructional supervisor. That's going to be more of a formal kind of relationship. That's going to be the principal that does the walkthrough and sits down and speaks with you about 3 things you did well and maybe 1 thing that you can work on. But you also have this content expertise. And this might not be a teacher. It might be a business and industry partner. It could be someone from your advisory committee, your program advisory committee, that can help you with those key pieces of learning. Like, what should I have a project that I should have my students to do that mirror business and industry? It's getting that external content expertise. And that's one of the reasons advisory committees are so important in career and tech education. And lastly, the instructional support. And instructional support can be the teacher down the hall. It can be someone that's had some experience teaching, that has picked up some tricks from the trade, that are willing to sit down and share those with you. Some of the key learnings from Chapter 3 talk about that support should be formal or informal. So what I want you to think about as you move forward is, who can be my support system? Who is that person that I can go and talk to formally or informally? Also, during this time, especially if you're a first-year teacher and you're in that survival phase, what I want you to do is think about how you can benchmark your successes, how you can take some data where you see some student growth over time. It can be exit slips where students weren't even doing them at the beginning of the year, and now you're starting to see some progress with just that one little area. Also, never stop growing. If you don't have a formal mentoring program, how can you get additional resources? How can you surf the internet? How can you find those different networking that can help you with your instructional planning? Stay connected professionally. LinkedIn, student organizations, CTSOs, your own professional organizations can be just a really place for you to get good resources and information. And then the last thing I want you to do is find a mentor or a professional friend, especially if you don't have one assigned to you. Find that person in your school that we call a believer. There's kind of 4 types of teachers in your school. They're the believers, the tweeners, the survivors, and the fundamentalists. Find that believer. Find that person that is an active learner themselves. They have a deep understanding for the students that both of you are working with. They have their own professional growth and they're always learning, and that they can serve as a role model to you to instill passion and continue the work. Chapter 4 talks a lot about classroom culture. And when I always work with teachers, new CTE teachers on classroom culture, I really focus them on thinking about your classroom as a high-performance workplace. We want our classrooms to be collaborative and have respect. So when you think about that, you need to think about 2 areas of what we call an enriched environment. And that the 2 areas are social and physical. And in a social environment, then we need to have classroom rules and procedures. And to establish buy-in from the students, have them to help you establish those rules and procedures. And I tell new teachers when I start working with them, it's never too late to get rules and procedures. If you don't have them now, you can do it now. Get buy-in from the students. Your physical environment is your classroom. And evaluate your classroom. Is it attractive? Is it engaging? And is it ever changing? Has that bulletin board been up there for 5 years? Is student work being posted? Are those things that say, this is my classroom, I'm proud of my classroom? So those 2 things together can enrich the environment and improve student learning. Some of the things that I want you to think about are some quick wins with your social environment. So when you think about the environment of your classroom that impacts success, some of those quick wins is greeting students at the door, making sure that you know every student's name, a little bit about that student, private reprimands for students that are misbehaving, and individual conferences. When you think about that, that leads to number 2, that if you do those things and you kind of make that your mantra, then your classroom will be based on mutual respect. And so when you think about what you learn from most of what students learn from the curriculum comes from the environment. So think about your classroom setting and your lab as a positive approach to learning.
Great stuff, Linda. I appreciate that, and I hope our listeners do too. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the information in Chapter 5, which really talks about teacher and student relationships. You know, career and technical ed and industry is really about technical problem solving. You know, and there is a difference. We kind of alluded to it in the beginning between your work environment and your education environment. You know, if you were if you were working in a manufacturing setting and you were trying to develop a new process, you know, to produce a new part, you might go next door to an engineer or to a machinist or to a welder, and you might ask them, you know, their opinion on how to change something, or you might ask them what the next step might be. It kind of talks about you know, the respect that you have for your peers and your willingness to recognize their value to a process. It's a little bit different in a classroom, though, because you respect your students and your teachers should respect you in a slightly different way. They don't have the expertise or the education that you do, and in most cases, you can't directly turn to them as a peer. Though you want them to contribute and be the best that they can be and help you problem solve and get them to problem solve on their own, that takes a little bit of time to develop. So it's important that teachers are able to set boundaries and maintain that authority and get that level of respect from the student. You know, what is an appropriate teacher relationship with their student? What does it look like? You know, how does a teacher handle social media, particularly when it comes to their students in their classroom? How do they handle communication both inside and outside the classroom? How do you establish a consistent climate of care and trust and respect? You know, a teacher in a technical classroom typically spends more time with a student than a regular education teacher would do. They may even spend more time with them year on and, you know, year one and year two or year three. So it's important to develop a relationship that is one that, you know, makes sure that you're trying to help the student grow, but yet that maintains that respect and authority of not only position but of individual knowledge. You know, the key learnings in Chapter 5 are really about the things that I just mentioned, that students should not be treated as your peers. So, you know, again, you have to make that transition from a peer-based environment to a, you know, more of an instructional environment. Remember that you really are the role model. You are the one who is modeling behaviors that you'll want your students to model, not only in your classroom, but in the work environment that they'll be moving into, you know, shortly after they leave you. Essentially, be a motivated, caring, and supportive educational professional, and that's the best thing you can do to help your students succeed.
Chapter 8, under planning, the title of this chapter is Don't Paint in the Dark, and I found that that really says a lot about the importance of lesson planning. And this chapter highlights some planning, and Book 2 really covers the planning more. But what I want you to think about when you think about planning is you probably have a curriculum map, something that teachers, the district, the state define for you on what to teach. And sometimes you have some unit plans from your state or your district. And then you drill down to the final thing, which is that daily game plan, that lesson plan. And one of the things that you could Google and look for if you're having a difficult time planning is the 5 E's: engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. That's a pretty straightforward plan to where you could begin to think about, from that curriculum map or your lesson plans, how to lay it out in a way to where you're beginning with the end in mind. So very quickly on the engage, that's the objective. What do you want students to know and be able to do? It's kind of the hook. It's kind of the way to get their attention. The explore phase is where you do something with hands-on. It could be something very simple as a KWL, which is know, want to know, and at the end of class learned. During the explain, that's where you get into some lecture. Never lecture over 10 to 15 minutes. Do that chunking. And then questions that engage the students. The elaborate stage is where they apply the work. That could be the content vocabulary introduced and working with that. And then the evaluate is the assessment piece. And when we talk about the evaluate piece, we're talking about probably an exit slip at the end of class, some type of formative assessment that you read at the end of class, and then that informs what you're going to do for that next day and how you're going to adjust the lessons for that next day. So some of the key learnings in Chapter 8 is that exit slip and that evaluation. That's where you know if the lesson worked or it didn't work. And then what can you do to change that? So that's that reflection. So when you think about your lesson plans, make sure they're unique to the student and the subjects. What are you planning? How can you make this, the technical skills that you're trying to teach, How can you embed that academic skills such as reading and math? Remember the 5 E's. Google it. Look at some lesson plan templates if you're struggling with the area of lesson planning. And then always, always make sure that the students are experiencing the learning, that they're doing hands-on.
Thanks again, Linda. We also wanted to just, in addition to touching on some of the content of the first book and highlighting the other 2 books, we also wanted to mention we have a couple other resources that we worked on with ACTE. We will be releasing the Putting Your Data to Work, which is about improving instruction in CTE at Visions 2018. And we also have a couple of other books off to the right-hand side of your screen there related to administrative leadership, career and technical education, and administrative leadership. We just wanted to make you aware that you can find those things on ACT's bookstore, or you can connect to them through NOCTI's webpage as well. But we really believe that there are instances when teachers want to just kind of settle back and learn on their own, and administrators want to learn on their own as opposed to a group, or they want to have some resources that can help them along the way, or maybe just some ideas. So hopefully that's what these books will provide. And hopefully this little spotlight session that we've presented here will help pique your interest a little bit into the resources that are available.
Great. Thank you, John, and thank you, Linda, and thank you to those of you who joined us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy days to learn a little bit about what NOCTI has to offer to help out our CTE teachers. That concludes our presentation today. If you need to get a hold of anyone, we have our contact information on the page here. You can follow us on social medias, find the links to the books that we talked about on our website, nocti.org. John and Linda's emails are on the bottom of your screen here. Thanks again, everyone. I hope you have a great afternoon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.